Good morning, everyone. Welcome. So our webinar today, Building a Solid Foundation, the Role of Healthy HR Practices and EPL Insurance in Small Business Risk Mitigation in 2023 is so incredibly important. And our speakers are going to make sure to emphasize some of the active changes that are happening in terms of risk mitigation practices and what small to medium-sized businesses can anticipate from a legal perspective, and how to make sure to avoid some of the risk and what you can do in terms of safeguarding your business. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Again, we are joined here by Lainey Cooney, Chief People Officer at Bambi, and Daniel Sprague, or Dan, President of Berkeley Select. I will go ahead and let our speakers introduce themselves and some of their experience. Lainey, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks, Tom. I've worked in a variety of industries, both private and public, domestic and international. I consider myself an industry agnostic. I've been around a whole bunch of different places. I've come to understand that the more things really seem different, the more they are actually the same. I love the challenge of complex problems, so I guess I'm in a good place in HR. I've led a number of merger and acquisitions. My last few roles have all been with startup companies, so start small and grow very big, and led them through massive periods of growth and expansion, including Blue Apron, FanDuel, and now, of course, Bambi. I started my career as a clinical psychologist in private practice, specializing in testing and assessment, and I'm really excited to be here today and have been invited to speak, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Lainey. Dan, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good. How are you, Dominic?
Doing very well. Let's hear a little bit more about some of your experience.
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me. My name is Dan Sprague. I'm president of Berkeley Select Insurance, based here in Chicago. We're part of the WR Berkeley group. We focus on professional and management liability for small and middle market businesses. I've got over 30 years experience in the industry. I guess a quick disclaimer, I'm an attorney, but nothing I should say here should be relied upon as legal advice. I got that out of the way, but I'm happy to share some of what we see out in the employment practices world, and look forward, as you said, to a conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. So let's go ahead and get started. A quick look at our agenda. We'll be talking about all things HR. Of course, this will be led by Lainey Cooney, our resident HR expert, before switching over and hearing more about EPL insurance from our insurance expert, Dan Sprague. We're going to try our best to make sure that this is a conversation. Again, if you have any questions, we've got some time for overview of risk management tips towards the end of our presentation, as well as some Q&A. So please reach out. We'd love to answer some of your questions. Let's go ahead and jump right in with our overview of HR. Lainey, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Tom. When you just look at this slide, you start to begin to realize just how comprehensive HR has become. So it's certainly evolved in the last several years. Not only has it become more expansive, but incredibly more complex. In the past, personnel departments, as they were affectionately referred to, was primarily charged with like hiring, firing, and paying people. There wasn't a strategic influence to the role, and things were far more consistent in terms of rules, compliance, regulations, and of course, the laws. The last 2 decades have seen an explosion in what falls under the human resource umbrella. Talent acquisition and pay practices are still core to our responsibilities. But in addition, you have performance management, compensation practices, learning, development, company culture, branding, communications, and of course, employee engagement, satisfaction, and their physical, emotional, and mental health are all core requirements and focuses. When you layer that scope of responsibility with a myriad of complicated regulations that vary not only by industry and by state, but now, most recently, cities and even municipalities have added varying requirements. You have a huge job to do with serious implications when anything goes awry. It's incredibly challenging to do this job with expertise and resources, but it is often overwhelming to small and medium businesses, especially the owners who simply want to run their business. They just want to make a living for themselves and the people that they employ. I strongly believe the vast majority of SMB owners want to treat their employees and strive to treat their employees fairly and compliantly, but is quickly becoming more difficult to do so on their own. So, that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of, just the scope, right? and the complexity, but also just what it means to have good HR practices. So like the thing that really comes through a lot of the times is things that should seem very simple, like your application, right? Having a sentence in there, having a checkbox in there that you shouldn't, having a question that you shouldn't can result in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit over a simple line on an application. Or take, for example, backgrounds. I don't know how many folks in the audience are running them, what you can consider, what you should see, how you should consider it against the person's actual job. And then if it seems to be not a fit for a lot of reasons, how you have to action that with pre-adverse action and adverse action, and whether you can actually withdraw or withhold the job offer. Like those are just two simple examples of things that seem pretty straightforward, but have all kinds of pitfalls if we go awry of it. I think the easiest ones people often think about is terminations, right? That's always a challenging one, even when done well. When it comes to terminations and you talk about best HR practices, there's a lot of guidance that's needed to give to managers in terms of documentation, how it's written, where it is stored, how it is communicated. One of the things that I spend a lot of time teaching managers about is the importance of contemporaneous documentation, meaning lots of time we're busy, so we have side notes, and then we don't ever really get them into a system on time. One of the things that raises is a lot of questions by attorneys and juries, et cetera, about, did you just make it up after the fact? We don't really know it. The strongest point that I always emphasize is if we are entering it into our computer, our personal notes, an HRIS system, whatever it may be, and it's contemporaneous, it's time-stamped, it's a much stronger documentation and a much stronger best practice in terms of being defensible. So most SMBs, I think the belief is they forgo dedicated HR support almost intentionally or with purpose. But many times this isn't an active choice, meaning a business owner doesn't have the time or the luxury, right, to consider the complexities, the time involved, the level of experience, and the cost of the HR resources needed, and therefore decide not to engage. More typically, the challenges to compliance and the serious consequences in terms of money and time, brand reputation, which is becoming increasingly huge, are unforeseen or seem so daunting that, you know, we do a little bit of the ostrich act, right? We bury our head and we hope that the danger just kind of floats on by us until something comes that really makes it no longer possible to hide our heads or stick them in the sand, which is usually a DOL notification, an agency inquiry, or worst of all, in some cases, a lawsuit. We've all employed a little denial when things seem incredibly complex and scary, but typically with the right resources and expertise, they're not nearly as intimidating as they seem otherwise. I use the terminology, the right resources, very intentionally. Human resources is a discipline that requires both education and experience that too often is underappreciated, and we either underhire because of the cost or lack of understanding of the skill set that's needed, or even how to evaluate an HR candidate. So that's exactly a big part of the reason why I came to be the Chief People Officer of Bambee, to lead and mentor a group of really talented and dedicated HR professionals so they're able to provide these services to our clients. So the other really big trip fall that I see is that initially an action may be totally reasonable. For example, a termination, but the employee feels slighted by the termination, even when handled well, and they can turn to legal counsel at the point to make a claim. After receiving the claim, the attorney will evaluate the merits of it. And even if the initial complaint doesn't have legs, no. The attorney will invariably start digging. And I mean digging, like a dog on a bone, often with the predetermined perspective or viewpoint that the employer must have done something wrong. We just haven't found it yet. And so even with HR solid practices and a vigilance to compliance, it's extremely difficult to be perfect on all fronts. And therein lies the quicksand. So I'll take a moment.
Hey, Lainey.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, it's a great job. Just to chime in there, just real quick, you know, a little later, we're going to talk about retaliation claims, which is one of the most common types of claims that we see, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is even if the underlying case and the first thing that they went after was not proven, they will always add on what they call a retaliation claim, which is, you were not treated exactly the same after the issue occurred. And that's how they really hang on. And to go to your dog on bone scenario, we are seeing the plaintiff's bar be as or more aggressive than we've ever seen. We attribute it to a couple things. One, to they're hungry because after a couple of years of COVID where things were slow, they're trying to pay for their boats. And secondly, they see this environment. They see the legal environment, the juries, and they're pushing their advantage because they know companies are afraid to go try these cases in this environment. So it's a really tough time. They're very aggressive, and you hit the point right on the head.
Yeah, and Dana, that's a great example, like retaliation, right? Somebody makes a complaint or there's an action, and then you get the retaliation claim. And typically the feeling is, we didn't do anything horrible wrong. Like we didn't treat the person mean, we didn't cut their salary, but even retaliation has now become defined in such smaller ways, like maybe the person wasn't invited to lunch as typically as often. Maybe it was just a schedule move. Maybe it was some meetings that they inadvertently weren't invited to. And so the poor business owner is like, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I wasn't mean to them. I didn't demote them. But even those things are like old days where those are just the big buckets. It goes down into such finer actions now. And that's just a really good example where the complexities are just expansive from what they used to be. I wanted to share a case. I worked 10, 12 years ago. We exited the employee for having garnished or pulled out a weapon in the environment. Clearly that violates our policies and probably almost every single person's policies on this call. So the employee took that to an attorney who basically said, I can't help you. If you pull out a knife in a work environment, you don't really have a leg to stand on, regardless of your intention. Great, check that box. But can I ask you, did you get your meal and rest breaks? Well, yes, actually I did. Okay, well, can I see your pay stubs? And in this particular situation, which is much longer, but there's a lot of compliance on the pay stub, right? Including an underlying requirement that we don't even want employees to use basic math to figure out how they got paid. So that means you have to have regular hours, rate, and totals. You have to have overtime, number of hours, rate, and total until you get to it. And in this particular case, one of those components was missing. And no matter how it was calculated, the employee suffered zero financial implication. Not one penny was mispaid. So you pull out a knife, you're fired for that, you go, what they dig into is the pay stub. They find an admin error that resulted in zero financial implication. And the initial filing in the court was over a $400,000 claim. I share that example because we would have thought everything was buttoned up. It was a group of really good HR professionals, and this is where we landed. Now, because of things like insurance and cooperation, we were able to settle that for significantly less. But let me tell you, the fear, the anxiety, and the time away from our other jobs was really expansive. So I share that as just one solid example of even when the initial action is done well, we're not out of the woods yet.
Thank you so much, Lainey. I really love that example because I like to talk about HR a little bit like fitness, right? You need to be on that healthy diet, doing all those healthy best practices, but doesn't mean you can't get hurt. So I think that story really emphasizes, why it's so important to have insurance for when something does go wrong. That said, Dan, go ahead and take us away for EPL insurance.
Sure, nice setup. I appreciate it. And please feel free to chime in, Lainey, as we go through. I'm going to chime in here and bring some good news and some bad news. So as Lainey well outlined, and I just want to reiterate, the good news is that you can significantly reduce your employment practices risk through implementation of best practices, having expert advice, and having adequate resources focused on these issues. We see it every day. Again, we handle over 800 claims a year, and I can't tell you how many of them we look at and say, if they just had someone with the right skill set focused on this earlier, would have been totally avoided. That is the key. The safety net underneath that, though, is employment practices liability insurance, or as we fondly call it around here, EPLI. Unfortunately, companies with all those best practices still get sued, and they will. And frequency and severity of claims are up. Unfortunately, no company, no matter the size or territory or operations, are really under the radar. Just to highlight a few of those points, in 2022, the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal police force for discrimination claims, had over 73,000 claims in that year. That was a 20% increase over the prior year. Shows you how the frequency is going up. Their budget for this coming year is almost $500 million and up 10%. They've said publicly they're looking to hire more than 350 new what they call frontline positions. These are not people to go work on the McDonald's case or the General Electric case. These are people to go out and look at small and middle market businesses and to work on those cases and the increase in those cases. To give you an idea, the average cost of an employment liability claim a few years ago, when it was documented, was $180,000. I would say it's probably north of $200,000 now. Now that includes larger claims also, but like I said, given the plaintiff's attorney's positions lately, it's difficult for us to settle even the smallest claims with a small company for less than $150,000 range. As we talked about, the judicial environment is difficult. To end on a high note, the good news is there is EPLI insurance broadly available. We are one of many, many companies that offer it, and it's at a reasonable cost. And at least I guess it's all for you to judge. And I know some of the people on the line probably have looked at EPLI insurance in the past. Some of you, I'm sure, are buying it. Some have thought that it was expensive, maybe when you looked at it. The market is softening, the pricing is going down, and for a typical small business for us, they will pay anywhere from $150 to $250 a month for EPLI insurance, and that's for $1 million limit. So that's nice protection, if nothing more than sleep at night protection. I think you should at least be looking at that.
Dan, one of the points you just raised, which I think is really important to, give it even a second mention, is that in the past, I think the perception is that, as you said, the McDonald's, the Starbucks, we see it all the time. And I think small and medium-sized businesses got a little bit of protection because they weren't the biggest player. There wasn't as much money, but even that distinction is going away now. And it's, for good or for bad, it's an equal field in terms of who can be targeted for this level of investigation. And you see more and more small and medium-sized businesses where in the past, I think it'd be like, I don't have that much money. I'm not that profitable. I'm just not that big of a company. But those distinctions there's not safety in those distinctions anymore, is there?
No, that's a great point. I hear a lot when I'm out talking to our customers. I've heard them say, well, Title VII only applies to companies with over 15 employees, which on the federal level is absolutely correct. But there are local, state, and other federal laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Equal Pay Act. Those are not Title VII. Those apply to a one-person, one-employee operation and can be just as damaging if that's what the attorneys, decide to try and pull you under. So like I said, there is no under the radar for these types of claims. We see them and we help defend them for companies from a handful of employees all the way up. Great point. I know everybody wants to learn about the details of insurance policies. Under the what does it cover area, I just wanted to highlight or list some things maybe that wouldn't come to mind so easily. Obviously, the discrimination, harassment, wrongful termination are pretty common. Failure to promote is one that we see once in a while that people probably don't think as much about, where you've got two viable employees, you pick one, the other one makes a case that it was because of something other than their performance. Getting back to the documentation and those challenges. Wage and hour violations, which is a little bit of a term in art, but it's really all the things Lainey talked about earlier with her example. All the things that come into paying people overtime, paying people for breaks, and how that all works. The details around that are, again, some landmines that people get tied up in, and wage and hour is a very common claim that we see. Failure to accommodate anybody with a disability is a protected class, and your failure to accommodate them. Most recently, there was the PWFA passed, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. That just happened about a month ago. You have some very clear duties to accommodate a pregnant employee. You may not know all the ins and outs of that, so you need to keep up on that. Family medical leave goes hand in hand with those issues. We already talked about retaliation, which is bolted on to any one of these original, initial claims.
Yeah, Dan, when you talk about failure to accommodate, that's another one that any business, but specifically small business, can get in trouble. Is they have a perception of what's going to be asked for as far as an accommodation. And the initial feeling is, I can't have somebody work a half a shift 3 days or intermittent leave or whatever the requirement is. And the feeling is, I can't do that. And so the pitfall to that is, I can't do it, so I'm not even going to engage in that conversation because I can't do it. And the reality to it is, in most of these situations, ultimately, if you make the wrong decision, you might face some consequences. But if you have the right process, those consequences are significantly lessened, and the financial implications are lessened as well. For example, there used to be a bright line, lots of bright lines. One of them would have been, and we still hear it a lot, is, oh, job abandonment, 2 days or 3 days, no show, no call, I'm going to fire him. And that's not a bright line anymore. And the question is, did you attempt to reach out? Yes, the employee has responsibilities to follow the company policies and protocols, but oftentimes it's like, did you even make that phone call to see if it was the beginning of a pregnancy and there was an illness, or there was a medication change? Or conversely, I can remember, those of you who don't know, I was at Home Depot for a while. I still bleed orange, absolutely love the company. But at the time, the requirement was you're available 7 days a week, right? Didn't seem unusual. And then, of course, people began to request Sundays off for religious practices and church attendance or whatever. And so most of the managers were like, absolutely, positively not. I can't even consider this, because if I let one person do it, the slippery slope philosophy, then everybody's going to ask for it. And so they denied it for a long time. And lo and behold, there's a lawsuit. And the lawsuit is because you didn't even engage in that conversation to say, okay, does everybody want to do it? Do you have to give the whole day off, or can you give a half day for morning or afternoon? Can you require them to work on the opposite Saturdays if Sunday is a day of observance, or vice versa? And it ended up to be a big lawsuit. So the other thing is, just even an accommodation, even if you don't believe you can successfully honor it, to have entered into the conversation, do a really good documentation of why you can or can't, or a different recommendation. For example, maybe I can't give you every weekend off, but I can make this accommodation. And so those are the examples where having the conversation and documenting those conversations clearly is the process. So even if somewhere down the line, the jury or the judge or the mediator says, I think you came to the wrong conclusion, think you could have done it, but you have this process where you sit down, you have the conversation, you're very clear about what the ask is, you document the ask, you document your counter to that ask that you can do. Those are all really excellent HR practices that our managers help our folks with, that there's another layer of protection. But just even if you're right that you won't be able to do exactly what they're asking for, to mitigate, you have to involve the conversation, the documentation, and counter proposals.
So I know we're running tight on time, so I'll hit this. So this is the what do I get? What am I paying for? If you look to EPL insurance, I just want to really highlight the legal defense piece of this. We work with the top EPLI or Employment Practices defense firms across the United States. We're one of their largest customers. We leverage that relationship and that buying power so that we get that top-notch legal talent for probably half of what you would get if you walked in the door. So it's those kinds of things, and not to mention I've got a team of expert claims adjusters who work in these cases day in, day out, 365. They're at your side when you need us. That's definitely a big part of the value proposition that you should be looking for from a carrier. Another thing a lot of people don't think about is reputation management. A lot of our products includes payment for a PR firm to help you if there's a reputational component to a situation. We see middle market companies taking advantage of that and utilizing that at times. And then finally, our pre-claim support hotline, most companies have, where you can call directly to an EPL attorney and talk about what's going on with the situation. You probably won't have to do that much if you have the kind of support that Bambi provides, but it's just another avenue, another point of support that most insurance companies give, and we do too. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. I know we are a little bit over. We've got just a couple of questions in the audience. If we're all good to answer those 4 questions we've got there. Yeah. All right. Let me go ahead and pull up these questions. Does insurance cover subcontractor claims?
Yes. Typically, most coverage will include coverage for anyone. It depends on what the definition of employee is under the policy. So you want to pay attention to that when you're shopping and you're looking and talk to your agent about it. But most coverage now in the market will cover a subcontractor as under the definition of employee.
Great. Looks like a follow-up question to that same question, which is, what about drug testing?
Does it cover drug testing? It would cover a claim, a EPL claim if it had to do with drug testing. Absolutely, sure. Obviously becoming a bigger piece of it. And, Lainey can talk about the policies now involved with more legal substances and how you've also got to be careful and manage those issues.
Mm. One of our attendees modified the question just a little bit, if you wouldn't mind speaking to it, is, can we run drug testing without getting sued?
Yes.
Easy. Amazing.
I mean, obviously those questions are about what are we testing for? What is the job? Is it legal, illegal substances, the company, the processes? So there's a lot around it, but the short answer is companies have done drug testing for a variety of safety reasons for a very long time. And it is definitely still within the scope of good HR practices.
Fantastic. All right. So our last question that we've got time for here today is, how challenging to HR leaders is the biometric regulation environment?
I'll jump in first, Dan. By biometric, I'm assuming you mean using fingerprints for clocking in and out, or eye capture for recognition on typically punching in and out or access to a building. So I'll answer the question from that perspective. Actually, not as challenging. In the past, I've seen it challenged by unions under the collective bargaining agreement and it needing to be tested. But with regards to time and attendance policies, I've not seen a lot of challenges. Dan, I don't know if you've seen anything differently.
Yeah, maybe because I'm overly sensitive being based here in Illinois, and Illinois was one of the first states to become very aggressive on biometric laws and pass a biometrics law. And of course, the plaintiff's attorneys, jumped over it and have gone to every company. Predominantly, it started, like we mentioned McDonald's laughingly earlier, but they really started with the restaurant chains who, in their advancement with technology and trying to use technology in different ways, started using fingerprint time cards and, like you mentioned, Lainey, and found problems under this law. It has been a big issue for a lot of companies. I haven't seen it as much in the smaller companies, small and middle market companies, just because they're not leveraging that technology as much. But the sensitivity around biometric data and keeping and retaining employee data in general, but definitely biometric data, is something we're definitely very aware of. You'll see in insurance policies different handling of that situation right now because it is becoming more of a hot topic. You want to check and see if that's excluded in your EPL policy or if it's what we call sublimited, to where it's covered but not to the same full limit of the policy.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. I do have a bunch more questions coming in the chat. Unfortunately, we are already over today. That said, this presentation has been brought to you by Bambi in partnership with Berkeley Select. Thank you, Lainey and Dan, for giving us such an incredible overview with your expertise. For those of you attending today who already have insurance but maybe don't use dedicated HR support, please contact Bambi. You can visit us online at Bambi.com and sign up. If you've got under 50 employees, you can get 1 month of Bambi for just $1. From there, we've got some really affordable pricing options available for you. And conversely, if you're attending here and you're already using a service like Bambi, you can actually save money on your insurance policies because they have the safety and trust that you are receiving HR support and guidance. And so it'll help you save some cost there. If you want to learn more about EPL insurance, go ahead and visit the Berkeley Select online at berkeleyselect.com. Thank you all so much. For those of you attending, you will be receiving a copy to this webinar presentation in your inbox in the next 48 hours. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day. Take care. Bye.